I'm Matt Nelson, Channel Technical Agronomist for Central Iowa. The year that was 2020 was unforgettable. Unfortunately, it was unforgettable for a lot of the wrong reasons. In fact, if 2020 was a car, it would be an AMC Gremlin. If 2020 was a candy, it would definitely be Circus Peanuts. If 2020 was a trip to the store, it would be one in which you forget what you're shopping for as you're walking through the store. You can't find your car once you leave. And when you get home, you realize that you forgot that bag of sugar that your wife really wanted you to buy. In short, if we could ask for a refund on the year that was 2020, I think most of us in agriculture would probably take Mother Nature up on that offer. That said, this challenging year did offer us a lot of invaluable learning opportunities, and my job here today, as your channel agronomist, is to try to help you unpack all of the lessons we learned from this growing season and try to figure out how we can apply some of these lessons to 2021 and to years beyond.
As mentioned, this is our 2020 agronomic year in review. This presentation will give me an opportunity to address some of the challenges that we faced in 2020, talk about some of the observations that could be made, whether to specific hybrids and varieties and how they responded to stress, or how agronomic practices played out with the results we saw at the end of the season, and also give me an opportunity to talk about some of the various issues caused by this unpredictable growing season and how those factors ultimately impacted yield at the end of the year. As I mentioned, 2020 was a year of many challenges. Here are just a few of them. In April, we had a couple snows early in the year, depending on your location. This followed by windy days, resulted in dry soil on top, but wet soil underneath. We also had soils that were very slow to warm, as we did not accumulate very many GTUs early in the season. As we moved to May into the later part of planting, depending on your location, we had several different frost events, I think 2 or 3 if you were in Northeast Iowa. Dry conditions caused issues with our residual pre-emergence herbicides, and a lot of them failed to activate. And residue and compaction caused emergence problems pretty much across the state, particularly in corn-on-corn fields. As we got into the vegetative time of year, in eastern Iowa, we had remnants of a monsoon that brought anywhere from 7 to 10 inches of rain in a short period, and prolonged dry conditions in western Iowa. July, we saw the triple threat of storms, wind, and hail, depending on your location. Corn rootworm pressure also started to manifest itself in the form of root lodging, and we saw the effect of that prolonged drought, as well as some really hot, windy days and warm nights affect pollination. And that was a large issue that we tracked as we moved into August. August brought more drought, actually the third driest in Iowa since 1980, and also the land hurricane, otherwise known as the derecho, that affected crop fields from west central Iowa all the way to the Mississippi River and beyond. As we got through the reproductive stage and into harvest, we saw snow in October, some late fall rain, and also as we progressed into harvest, some very windy days, which caused a lot of these very stressed corn plants to heave and give their last in terms of stalk lodging, which really delayed and made harvest very painful. As we go planting window by planting window, the first this year would have been early April, somewhere between the 1st to the 18th. These windows will not be 100% precise, but in general, these trends fit most of the state. We had warm conditions in late March, and it turned cool rather quickly once we got to mid-April, but in general, we had nice planting conditions to start the month. Soil temperatures were actually well above 50 degrees on April 9th, but they came below 50 degrees very quickly. We had, again, snow, as I mentioned, around this time as well. In general, crops planted in this window performed well and enjoyed nice conditions, which, again, drives home the reminder that when it is fit, if the long-term forecast appears to be warming, it's not a bad idea to go out and plant if you are prepared to do so. These were some social media posts from the time. As you can see on the left, that picture is dated April 8th. If you were in southeast Iowa, our soil temperatures were actually well over 55 degrees, and pretty much the entire state, with the exception of the extreme northern reaches, had soil temperatures above 50 degrees. By April 12th, however, 4 days later, as you can see in this next image, we were well below 50 and stayed there for a few days. This is some weather data from Nashua, courtesy of the ISU Mesonet, that shows our highs and lows and our GTU accumulation from April 10th through the end of the month. And what you can see is that early period there in April, while the highs were good and we had some warm soil conditions, the lows really dropped off, especially there around the 14th through the 16th, before they rebounded, and we actually closed the month with a lot of nice 70-degree days and soil temps that rose pretty dramatically, going above 50 degrees on April 22nd. The second planting window was April 18th through the 31st. In my opinion, a ton of planting was done in this window. We were warm. As I mentioned, we accumulated plenty of GTUs. If actually you had planted around April 18th or 19th, your corn probably would have emerged by the end of the month. We also had some issues with this planting window. Strong winds, particularly at the end of the month, really caused problems. I had farmers contact me who actually had to quit planting because so much residue was blowing back across the rows after they went by with their planter. And as I mentioned before, conditions were dry on top. We were throwing dust, which is always the goal when we're out planting, but we were wet at that 2 to 2.5 inch depth, which caused some sidewall compaction and some smearing. Looking at departure from normal temperature over the month of April, in general, April was a chilly month, but it varied. It depended on where you were at. Conditions were closer to normal for most of the southwest part of the state, but were much cooler as you started to move east. Again, looking at those GTUs accumulated throughout that early part of April, really not much happened across wide stretches, and it seemed to take a while for us to finally get close to that 100 to 120 GTU range. When I talked about compaction, compaction was actually not just limited to sidewall compaction from 2020, but also 2019 compaction as well. I got a lot of calls to go out and look at stands of corn that appeared to be struggling. This is actually a social media post of mine from April 30th, where we definitely had some emergence issues. And as I began to dig down the furrow, I could pull up large chunks anywhere from 6 to 8 inches long, where the sidewalls were really heavily compacted. Here are some other examples of issues that I saw. Furrows that actually did not close for various reasons. Some of these could have been planter adjustments. I think in general, we had a lot of furrows that were left open because we were planting in conditions that were a little too wet. We also had a lot of corn plants specifically leaf out underground. And leafing out underground occurs when we have really cloddy soils caused by either fall tillage conditions that are too dry, or sometimes spring conditions that are actually too wet and create large clumps of soil. When we plant into that, oftentimes what happens is as that seedling is starting to emerge, we're pushing up towards the soil. Sunlight can get in through those cracks, and when that young seedling sees light, it will start to throw leaves out. And if that ends up underground, a lot of those are seedlings that we end up losing. So cloudy soil is the main culprit there. The seed to soil contact was not what we wanted, and the conditions above that seed were not great either. We also had quite a bit of soil crusting, which mainly impacted soybeans. Here are a few other posts from some agronomists across the state. The one on the left, this is from June 10th, actually, so a bit later, diagrams some of the issues that we had with either stalks or other corn residue being rearranged after planting due to wind. And this residue actually caused several issues. One could be if your soil is at 2 inches deep when you plant it, and now it has 2 inches of residue on top of it, it now has 4 inches that it needs to try to push through. That could also cause nodal roots to develop in the residue instead of in the ground. It could also just tax that seedling as it tries to work its way through the residue. That also caused issues with soil warm-up. If there's heavy residue on the ground, what we found was that residue kept the soil beneath it from warming up as fast and from drying out, as that residue shields that ground from the sun and also holds moisture in. Matthew Darr here on the right posted a really nice video looking at sidewall compaction and how to check for that with a knife or a seed gauge. And essentially, if you can't penetrate the sidewall very easily, then your downforce is too high. If it requires work to get that knife in, you're probably compacting that sidewall. And I agree with what he said in this tweet. It's a 10-second check that can really save yield, as what we mess up at planting will continue to stick with us for the rest of the year. The sins of planting really did haunt us again in 2020. As we moved into May, we had a little bit better planting conditions. Really, the large issue here was dry conditions in the western part of the state and low GTU accumulation in northern Iowa. If you planted in late April or early May, I believe over the first 13 days of May, we accumulated 30 GTUs total. That is a very low amount. So that seed was sitting in cold, wet soil most places. We also had the frost events that we mentioned, which injured and killed some of the earliest planted soybeans. In certain counties, Audubon County, for example, a lot of soybeans were planted in mid to late April. So fairly early for our norms here when it comes to soybean planting. In western Iowa, we actually had issues with soils being too dry, especially amongst very finely tilled soils. I stopped to dig some in some fields around May 10th and was having to go 3 to 4 inches deep to find adequate moisture for germination in fields that had been tilled multiple times. So a lot of that seed sat in the ground, and we were getting calls from farmers wondering if they should plant it deeper, say 3 inches or more, or if they should wait until a rain and just plant it at 2 inches and hope moisture comes at some point. Unfortunately, for most people in west central Iowa, the month of May did not hold much rain. A lot of regions only recorded about 4/10 over that entire span. Here are a few more pictures from northern Iowa. Again, low GTU accumulation. These cold temperatures also caused us to have some issues with pre-emergence herbicides. These delayed emergence issues caused some plants to sit in herbicides for longer than they should, which led to some buggy whipping and some products struggling to unfurl. And I guess one thing I really want to highlight here is the value of seed treatments. Those seeds that were treated with fungicide as they sat in that ground for 20 plus days, whether it was wet or dry, that only taxes that seed. And the more protection it has to get it up out of the ground and establish a healthy stand, the better.